Welcome to our panel discussion, How Long Till Black Futures Month? Honoring Black History, Cultivating Black Futures. Today's forum is sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. And Union Presbyterian Seminary's new Master of Arts in Public Theology degree program. Are you called to be a Christian leader in the public square? Know someone considering theological education? Contact our admissions directors at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists are Dr. Grace D. Gibson, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Reverend D'Angelo Dia, Academic Advisor for Empowered at the Community School of Davidson in Charlotte, North Carolina. Summer Jordan, a Master of Divinity student and Black Caucus moderator at Union Presbyterian Seminary. And Reverend Dr. Sakina Young Skaggs, Senior Associate Dean of Religious Life and pastor of Memorial Church at Stanford University. Our host and moderator is Reverend Melanie C. Jones, Assistant Professor of Ethics and Theology and Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Reverend Jones, the floor is yours.
Welcome to the Just Talk, Talk Just series, again sponsored by the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Again, my name is Melanie Jones, and I am the director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. I wanted to open our conversation by setting context for tonight. As you know, February is Black History Month. The origins of Black History Month trace back to Harvard-trained historian Carter G. Woodson and Howard-bred minister Jesse E. Moorland's Negro History Week, which was first marked by the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1926 as an effort to organize events and learning activities to honor the rich and vibrant legacy of achievements of peoples of African descent. With right activist energies emerging from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the early Black Power movement of the 1960s, young students of Kent State University were eager to propose a month-long observation that would hold up the often undertold story of Black triumph as a counter-narrative to the popular saga of mistreatment of Black people in America. By 1976, in conjunction with the U.S. Bicentennial, February was recognized as Black History Month by the U.S. government, which spawned a progressive series of recognizing and sharing stories of people of African descent across the nation. The central premise of Black History Month in America is to affirm that the history of Black people did not begin in 1619 with the first Africans who were brought to Jamestown, or in 1640 with the first documented enslaved African in Virginia by the name of John Punch. Our story did not begin in chains. Our diverse religious orientations did not originate with slave-holding Christianity. Our roots are not simply grounded in a foothold of oppression. And where there has been domination, our ancestors have exercised revolutionary acts of resistance through inventions, socio-political protests, African-derived religiosity, creative and artistic expressions, and strategies for survival. To be clear, Black history is American history. The hill we climb, as Amanda Gorman says, exposes that the history of America reflects a terrible tragedy of conquest, cradled in continuing dehumanizing assaults against Black life. Black History Month, then, is necessary to force America to confront its ugly truths, but also to resurrect what Cornel West calls subversive joy, and to revel in the belief that Black lives matter and enslavement, segregation, mass incarceration, police brutality will not have the last word. Black History Month seeks to remember heritage. We are charged with the spirit of Sankofa to go back and get it and fetch the stories that illuminate the underside of an American quest for freedom and independence. For there is a birth of this nation that champions rebels with a cause, like Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, Marcus Garvey, Harriet Tubman, Assata Shakur, and countless revolutionaries in Zion. Black History Month, in line with Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, helps us to call out the lies, to debunk the myths of respectability, and refuse to succumb to one-dimensional or monolithic portrayals of Black people. As we honor MLK and Malcolm X, we can never forget freedom fighters like Bayard Rustin, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Angela Davis, Prathia Hall, and all of those names who are often missing from our history books. This is a season to celebrate trailblazing firsts, seconds, thirds, fourths, millennials. And to recognize that for 28, sometimes 29 days out of the year, February is the time of year to celebrate the genius of Black folk creating a new world and shining like the sun-kissed people that we are through artistry and aesthetics. Sci-fi and fantasy writer N.K. Jemisin posed the question in a provocative essay, how long till Black Futures Month? To engage Black representation in the stories developed, told, and shared for today's living and future generations. If we can take a trip Black to the future, the term Afrofuturism was first coined by white cultural critic Mark Derry from his 1994 essay, Black to the Future, where he analyzed ways Black college students began to use science and technology as a means for social change in the 1980s and 90s. Derry's central question was, can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed, imagine possible futures? Screenwriter Watasha Womack, in her salient text, Afrofuturism, the World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, she argues, quote, Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. Afrofuturism combines elements of science fiction, historical fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, Afrocentricity, and magic realism with non-Western beliefs. It is genre that is intentionally integrates religious, theological, and spiritual beliefs, often while also interrogating these aims. Tonight, we are engaging in an exciting talk to discuss Afrofuturism, digital technocultures, and the role of fantasy, imagination, and cultural aesthetics toward enlivening a just world. We've gathered a brilliant group of scholars and students to dialogue about honoring Black history, but also cultivating Black futures. For those of you who've joined us online, we invite you to drop your questions right there in the chat so that we can ask and answer our panelists all throughout our conversation tonight. I want to begin with opening some questions to our panelists. First, to Dr. Sakina Youngs-Saggs. Given your dissertation work on Afrofuturism, womanist phenomenology, and the Black imagination, a liberative revisioning of Black humanity, I'm curious, Dr. Skaggs, how has the Black imagination been developing a liberative vision for Black humanity?
Thank you for that question. From the initial question, I would like to come back and think about two things. One, the distinction between Afrofuturism and what Annette Okorafor says, African futurism without any space, right? Afrofuturism is a counter-narrative. Afrofuturists works towards being a counter narrative, not just merely in the self-determination or the Du Boisian sense of double consciousness, but deploying a consciousness that is centered or recentered using bell hooks or Lewis Gordon's notion of what we shift the geography of reason, you shift where you begin. And so Afrofuturism and African futurism is distinct in that it shifts the location of beginning. And it revisions Black humanity in a way that helps understand what can be not only imagined, but what can be lived out. When I talk about Black humanity in my work, particularly, I am looking at this existential, ontological self that we are and how we are in the world. And so I use Afrofuturism and Black speculative fictionism, Black speculative fiction more broadly, to look at the way and the concepts that we use to shape our identity, but also the way we shape ourselves in the world, and how that engagement begins to take root in changes in social structures, such as, for example, the one I use oftentimes is grassroots modalities. One grassroots modality, for example, is housing. Housing is very practical. We struggle with it. We look at gentrification. And one particular scholar out of Philadelphia uses Afrofuturism to reshape the way in which we engage in everyday issues, such as housing. She looks at it, her name is Rashida Phillips, and she looks at it particularly in looking at communities and the way in which they have to revision themselves. And the key part of that, you talked in your introduction about the Sankofa ethic, which we take from both Katie Cannon and Prathia Hall. But as an ethic, Sankofa ethic takes our history and our narrative and reweaves it so that we can understand our present and understand what happened in the past so that we can envision a different future. In Afrofuturist scholarship, such as Kenitra Brooks and John Jennings, they call this the technology of storytelling, Sankofa narration. And so how we can, in very practical ways, see ourselves and then advocate for ourselves on grassroots level is what Afrofuturism and how we can engage. Now, I always call it, of course, when I call it liberative vision, it's life-giving joy, right? And so when I think about the act of speaking for oneself and defining oneself, that's life-giving joy to me.
Thank you, Dr. Saggs. I think that brings me to question for Dr. Grace Gibson. I'm thinking where there has been a Black power movement, for instance, there was also a Black arts movement. And your work, Dr. Grace, looks at Black studies and particularly comic books. I'm wondering how Afrofuturism might give perspective to this Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on. I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation. So when thinking about this question and this idea of like Afrofuturism and putting it in the perspective of Black Lives Matter movement, I think about Michelle Roth-Truell's framework in his book, Silencing the Past, where he's discussing and understanding the silences in historical narratives and, using strategies to address them. And so for me, I look at how Afrofuturism is a way and a strategy for those that are taking part in the Black Lives Matter movement to pick up on the legacy of previous movements and kind of like looking at this era of change. And so there's this era of change, then there's also this idea of representation that is needed. And because Afrofuturism is about acknowledging the past, that, looking at the present and how do we rewrite the future so that we continue to have a future, this definitely fits really good in with what Black Lives Matter movement is trying to do. And like I said, when you think about it in the sense of representation, there's historical, there's cultural, there's legal, there's political, and these are all things that Afrofuturism seeks to prevail, seeks to put out there, seeks to pursue. And in order for us to exist in the future, we have to make sure to acknowledge those things. And how do we rectify that? How do we rewrite the narrative? And in many cases, that's what Afrofuturism can allow or can be used as far as with regards to Black Lives Matter.
That's helpful. Reverend Dia, I'm thinking about your work as an educator with age school or school age role. What is the ongoing role of art and fiction in creating space to imagine a more positive Black future for Black children? I think you're muted.
Thank you. I was just saying, I missed the first half of your question. You kind of went out there, but if I don't fully answer it, just correct me. But the role, I don't think this movement could exist without the arts. Our very embodiment is art in itself. I think it's a matter of defining or realizing where the entry point or the gateway is for each of us. I love that Dr. Gibson has those Funko Pops on her shelf right there. I'm sorry, that just really distracted me, but that relates to where I'm going. I love that. I just saw that. Like, what is the gateway or the entry point for everyone to identify Afrofuturism in their very embodiment and being? And for me, it is in the lens of visual and performance art. And I would go as far as saying, even like things like the Funko Pops that are on the sister shelf there, to be able to see your representation, your embodiment reflected in something. For me, the gateway was flipping through my father's albums and coming across Parliament Funkadelic, not really knowing the fullness of what they were saying, what they were preaching to me, I would go as far as saying, but I knew it was doing something for my spirit. The ideal of this grown man dancing around in a diaper, something about the essence of that Black boy joy, and the fulfillment and the manifestation that they go about with that. And then I would also say groups like Afro Cobra. If you don't know this group, I highly recommend checking them out. Afro Cobra, Afro Cobra stands for African Coalition of Black Radical Artists. The work they were doing to create and have ownership of our own narrative, as opposed to having colonials write the narrative for us and give us these depictions that exist. So finding those spaces and places, when I think about the music, when I think about the attire that we, I think about just our embodiment when we walk, seeing a Black man walk out of a barbershop, the nature of that feeling, seeing a sister get her locks tightened up, that very essence is Afrofuturism. And I love this renaissance that we're in right now, the reacclimation of that, whether it's in the form of performance art with dance, revisiting like the musical vibe of the work that Janelle Monáe is doing. This is a great time to be Black. I mean, it's always been a great time to be Black. Let me be clear about that. But the essence of being able to step out of your door and feel like the counter narrative is so strong now that others can't deny it. I like to think of Afrofuturism as to, this is going to be a weird analogy for this. The insurrection is to white supremacy as Afrofuturism is to Black Panther. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. It has been seen, you have to acknowledge it, you have to reconcile with it, you have to reckon with it. Whatever you do with it, it is there. It's not going to diminish by any regards.
Yeah, I mean, I really am thinking from your conversation there about Black Panther as, for many, the kind of gateway, the awakening to a kind of Afrofuturist imagination, as well as alternative worlds for Black imagination and for Black fantasy. And in one way, right, we collectively mourned the death of Chadwick Boseman as ours, right, as our Black Panther. He was a Howard grad, HU, But in addition to that, like all Black folk were able to kind of mourn his passing, because it was like a piece of not only our culture, but also of our imagination had been lost. Summer, when I think about that, your work as a media enthusiast and just a fascinating thinker on this, what do you think is the balance between what we might call as Black emphatic media, like Black Panther, right? And then kind of Black normalcy in media, where these depictions of Black people within these contexts do not just become fantasy, but they become everyday kind of images for us or portrayals?
Well, thank you for this question. I really love it. This is something I talk about quite often with my father and my brother. We love Black Panther. As you said, we all mourned when Chadwick died. because that was very traumatizing in its own way, because it seemed, oh, wait, the hope is lost. What happens for Black Panther 2? And that Black emphatic media is so almost integral to our existence. That was the hope. That's the starting ground. We have so far to go. That being said, we should not relegate ourselves to only being seen in this emphatic sci-fi fantasy world. We need spaces for that Black normalcy. And you have movies like The Photograph, which is just a romance. And that's beautiful and simple. And then you have Bridgerton, which is Black people in Regency era England. And that's also quite fascinating. And Black Panther was, again, that stepping stone that allowed people to see, oh, Black faces and Black bodies can sell tickets, can make money, can be marketable, when for so long we were seen as not so, and we're only marketable to our own kind. And it's important to find the harmonies within both in this space. And in my own context, in my undergrad, I was a theater major as well as an archaeology major. And in both of those worlds, Black life, Black people are not held as something that is inherently necessary to the progression of either field. When if you really think about it, for theater and media and the visual arts, as Brother Dio was saying, we are the culture. We make the history. We are the people who try things and then other people take it and run with it and make all the big bucks. And with archaeology as well, a lot of our archaeological facts and findings that are mesmerizing are coming from Black people and what was left behind for them. So to have these images in movies and television that allow you to see Black people in a different context, be it sci-fi or normal life, is really helping people see us as people and bring us into conversations outside of the arts, which is very, very important.
Can I add something to that there?
Absolutely.
And I just want to add, like, for those listening, like, that have that illusion in their head that this just starts with Black, those that are listening and may think that, oh, this just starts with Black Panther. It's always been there. When I think about the essence and beauty of individuals like Richard Roundtree and Shaft in Africa, or Pam Grier, that essence is always, or when I, fast forward a little, like De La Soul or Tribe Called Quest, it's always been there. I think some of my white peers assume, oh, this is something that just, Black Americans sparked on this because Marvel decided they were going to throw us a token. No, we didn't need Marvel. I appreciate what Marvel is doing. Thank you. But we didn't need them to affirm ourselves. We were already affirming ourselves in so many different outlets. I just wanted to add that for you that may be listening.
I can add to that too. Also, even to add on to, what Brother D was saying with who kind of like has already existed, we can even take it back to Du Bois and his short story, The Comet. And, so if people want to get intellectual and say, okay, well, who are the scholars that, brought in Afrofuturism? Well, Du Bois brought that to the picture. His short stories really, truly told a story that people, hadn't thought about. And, that allow Black people to exist in these spaces. So, as you mentioned, Marvel, was able to capitalize and make Black Panther a space for us to see where we can thrive and, make money. But, definitely we have existed, much longer, or before that, I should say, not longer, but definitely prior to that.
That's exactly where I was going to go, Doc, was Du Bois. I taught the comet this afternoon with my students. And one of the things that, to see a new generation have that epiphany, that aha, that, Afrofuturism has been around for a long time. Blacks have been challenging, not just with protest, but with our intellect for years, the structural systemic oppression, white capitalistic patriarchy. And so in the Comet, we see that. We know Du Bois, yes, we know him this month as the founding father of, NAACP and the sociologist, but he wrote science fiction. If we go back to the 1800s, we have Charles Chestnut, The Goop from Grapevine, my favorite story. And so there's this notion of narratives and intellects retelling, reshaping Our story has been around for a long time, and we can constantly hear echoes. Certainly, you talk about Parliament Funkadelic, my goodness, the jazz era. If jazz was nothing but Afrofuturism, I don't know what is. I look at, yes, my young Skaggs is Larry Young Jr. And I tell the story of, typing a paper for the Caribbean Philosophy Association, listening to a tune called Spaceball. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is from the 1960s and 70s. It was so Afrofuturistic, it blew my mind, and so the ancestors talk to us, if we don't yet get it, that it has been here and part of who we are for generations after generation after generation. It just wasn't called African futurism or Afrofuturism. And we have to continue to reclaim that.
Yeah, I'm also thinking of some early voices like Sun Ra, and you named George Clinton, and even Octavia Butler, particularly just how prophetic and timely for this. But I have a question about how would you define the major elements that form our definition of Afrofuturistic media?
I'm assuming that's just open for anyone to chime in on that.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, and for me, because of the field I'm in, I always look for a disruptive text. Where is the text disrupting the current contextual fabric of what's going on? I think that's an essential element for me, as well as the ownership. Who are the stakeholders at the table presenting the work? We had mentioned Marvel here and other, the big two, Marvel and DC. But there was a group, Milestone Media, which was a comic company owned by Black people, run by Black people, writing characters that represented Black and brown people. Dwayne McDuffie, and now I think Reginald Hudlin may be the president of the company now, and Dennis Cohen. But to have that representation where we are the villains, we are the postal workers, we are the surgeon generals, et cetera, in the work. Those are essential elements for me, but I also think it's an evolving thing. I think as media evolves, as we digitally evolve, the context of what those elements are, I think it'll be like hip hop. It'll continue to forever morph and change in some form.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that.
I see Vereen Cornell. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying, I'm a firm believer also in that.
Go ahead.
It's ever evolving. Like we will, there's always trying to find the definition, but I don't, I think we will, have a definition today, but 5 years we'll have an addition added to it, like another addendum that will be added to it. And, that's part of the change agent. That's part of the legacy of what Afrofuturism is.
I wanted to say that I think part of that change comes again with us making Afrofuturism, Black speculative arts, wider and more diverse. So for example, Nigerian and Ghanaian and Caribbean voices, expanding it across the diaspora. So there's a global, we look at, we love to do things in waves, right? And so, there was 1.0 with Alondra Nelson when she was talking in the digital techno, age. And then there was 2.0, Ronaldo Anderson kind of talked about the 2.0. But I think we're approaching something different as well. I think that as we continue, not only with technology, but also with different mediums, you have, I want to say Gaskins, her work is amazing. She's using digital technology to do art, and to Nutrice Gaskins, I think it's her full name, and Dr. Nutrice Gaskins, and her work in digital technology and bringing that to life and speaking with an Afrofuturistic voice, using a vernacular, she calls it, of technology. And so we have to look at the ways in which we're including, again, Annette Okorafor, I love her work. If you call her work Afrofuturism, she might cut you. So it's African futurism, no hyphen, and we know that, this is, we identified, again, this self-determination thing. We went from Negro to capital N to African, Afro-American, Afrofuturism, again, that shift in how we say who we are and how we present our work and what we do. and that, right, one comes back to someone like Anandra Nelson, who talks about the shifting of cultural production. So, what we produce in the sphere, I think will continue to redefine what those major elements of the media, what those major genres for that matter are. We have a vibrant gaming community. I just someone who got a grant to do Afrofuturism and gaming, so we're constantly redefining where we fit and where it can come to life. And for me, it's all about how it comes alive.
I would add as one of those elements, the accessibility as well. And when I think about the evolution of it, and as an educator, I'm seeing it make its way into, it is becoming the canon. I'm proud and I'm excited about that, because there's some rubbish out there. I don't understand why we still teach or even use as a mentor text. But the accessibility of it, you take something like the work of Octavia Butler, which may not be, the access of that for a middle schooler may not be as conducive. But now you can pick up Parable and The Sower in a graphic novel format. So to be able to see yourself in that medium in a way that, 20 years ago, that it just didn't exist, unless someone was, doing it underground. That accessibility is an element. It's becoming more of an element also. I think Dr. Jones may have froze on us.
Talk a little bit more about those forms of media, if you would.
Yeah, like comic books is like the ultimate gateway, I think, for people trying to figure out what they want to do with this work and really finding yourself. We look at things like, I give you 3 off the top of my head that I think everyone should access. I think every adult, regardless of your age, should go back to reclaiming being a kid and pick up a comic book. But there's this book called Naomi, which is published by DC Comics, and Naomi just got picked up by Ava DuVernay. For CW, I believe it's going to be on. But seeing something like that, the technology and the genius of seeing a woman of color in that role. There's Far Sector, which is seeing a Green Lantern of color. That the very power that we have is our imagination. That's always been our superpower. I mean, we have always created a culture within a culture. If this movement is nothing else, it is the ability to create a culture within an oppressive culture. And we've consistently done that. So to see it in a book format, a graphic novel, for me, a big part of my work, the work that I currently have on display on the Mint Museum in Charlotte, is a collection of drawings that were inspired by Maurice Sundike, the writer for Where the Wild Things Are. I love the book. I love his art, but it doesn't speak to me. So I wanted to recontextualize those characters with my own cultural embodiment within the nature of what he was doing. And we're seeing more and more of that as a medium. I mean, I love that you mentioned the gaming. I think that's major. Now we see, we look at PS5 just came out with a new Marvel game in Kamala Khan. Years ago, you would not see a woman of representing the Islamic community in a video game. I think everyone should go out and pick that game up as well. But, I don't work for, PlayStation or anything, so I don't get an endorsement check. So, but the game in itself is great. And then someone like Miles Morales, the very nature of what we've been looking for. That narrative is our narrative. I think there's some characters they could just get rid of for me because they've culturally appropriated our narrative. I have a problem with Superman. That is an immigration story. It's not his story to tell. I mean, it could be, I guess, in some regards. I don't want to discredit that nature, but that's our very embodiment is that story.
So you speak my language with comics. I did my dissertation on Black female superheroes in comics, and the identity. They're creating these identity formations, and I agree. Like the fact that now comics is accessible through graphic novels. You're able to get Octavia Butler's story told through a graphic novel. You're also able to get the STEM story of Black girls in STEM through Lunella Lafayette, Moon Girl, and Shuri. You're able to have all these different characters, and definitely everybody from Milestone, Rocket in particular for me, and Hardware. These are characters that are really telling our stories and from our viewpoints, and we're not having to wonder did they do their research? We know they did their research. We can see it, we can read it. It's it's made visual, and or even Misty Knight and looking at Black women and disability. And so like these are all stories and narratives that don't get talked about and get, you know, marginalized and pushed to the side. And Afrofuturism, for me, I truly believe allows an avenue to tell those stories so that we can talk about them and they can be normalized and not just in the moment or in a particular time.
And the cosplay narrative of that as well. You know, when you look at comics and you look at, you know, Black cosplayer now, like they don't have to put on the green makeup for She-Hulk now. And Storm's not the only comic book character. Just the beauty of that, like going and seeing sisters, you know, own it. It's amazing.
So, you know, you brought up my transition in that one of the, what I would consider the way in which it comes alive is in not just cosplay, but in Black comic culture, comic convention culture in particular. We hear about the big San Diego Comic-Con, but there's a whole, you know, what do we want to call the chitlin circuit or not? You know, there's a whole underground of Black comic conventions throughout the country. The two most happened at the beginning at the end of last month during the Martin Luther King holiday. Again, this is part of that Black speculative arts movement 2.0. It's held, the first part is held at the Schomburg. And it's the 9th year. So they've had a comic convention. And the second part is held the same weekend, but towards the end of the end part of the weekend, it is held in San Francisco. So you have coast to coast and you have everybody. So the author of the graphic novels that you just mentioned on Octavia Butler, John Jennings, Matt Duffy, they're at those Comic-Cons. They're doing workshops with kids on how to draw. And then at the same time, it's the experience of going in and seeing that kind of representation you know, in the tangible experience. Seeing Avery, who does work around horror, seeing scholars who do work around hair, seeing what I would call, you know, loot. One of my favorite is Huff. She was an FBI agent. If you know her work, Huff, she was an FBI agent. And she actually sued the FBI and won for sexual discrimination. And she created a comic book. Well, as a result, she didn't just create a comic book. She had a line of PJs and sweatsuits and jackets and, you know, so that loot. And then to be able to take that away, that material culture, and to see that come alive in comic book culture, in comic convention culture, is amazing. There's nothing like it. And so not only do I say, when I talk to parents, I'm doing a Saturday school right now with kids, helping them craft. It's called Superhero Saturday School. It's helping them craft their superhero. So I tell them to take them to comic book shops, but if they can go to a comic convention, there is nothing like it, because it's not just comic books. It's film, it's movies. For the adults, we can watch some of the premieres of film, but for everyone else, I mean, it's just every genre is present, and they try to make a concerted effort to do so.
I want to bring in two questions from the chat from Vereen Parnell. She asks, in our trajectory of not only thinkers and artists, but is it too simplistic, she says, to include Muhammad Ali and James Brown in this trajectory?
I guess my question would be like, how do we define simplistic in that nature? I don't know if I would look at James Brown or Muhammad Ali in any form of being simplistic. I would say, in reference to James Brown, the beauty of that narrative and his contribution to it is that I often feel like the Southern narrative is shammed on unjustly, and that, you know, Augusta, Georgia spirit can't be denied. And so I wish there was more of a counter. I wish there was more of a, I don't have the right way to say this, but more of a balance of that. You know, one of my conflicts I do have with some of the characters we mentioned and some of this, you know, the nature that we see going on is that in the South, it often feels so rooted in a conservative ideology and philosophy that a lot of our narrative doesn't get a chance to move past that threshold. So then we're looking towards images in places like Chicago with Riri Williams, or, you know, Brooklyn with Miles Morales. There are very few stories that are rooted, very few that I come across in the genres that I'm reading right now that are rooted in a Southern appeal. So when I think about James Brown, it's that Southern appeal for me. It's that Southern tenacity. It's that resilience that we often label as being country or ghetto. that he represents for me.
Yeah, I would agree. And add, there needs to be more Black Southern, stories and narratives in the picture. So if we're going to talk about the African diaspora, we can't just limit it to certain areas of the diaspora. You got to include the South, and definitely James Brown with his music and his style, which was original. And people are copying him, and so or even someone like Muhammad Ali, who was, in a way preaching, through boxing. And so the ways in which he is able to have this confidence that a lot of people saw as arrogance, and and he was able to stand true to who he was, and be firm about that, and the same with James Brown, just through music. So yeah, I would definitely say that they could be included in that trajectory. That's the great thing about Afrofuturism, is that it can be inclusive, and not just relegated to certain individuals or themes or types of mediums.
I would argue also that the piece that just dropped, One Night in Miami, is as Afrofuturistic as it comes, and that's Ali. And so that piece does speak to the Southern experience. Although Malcolm X is in the South in that context, but it's four brothers, and it's the question of what if. It asks the question of what could have happened in this conversation had it happened. So it really digs at the possibility. And then in our contemporary context, Jarvis Sheffield, who is the president of the Black Sci-Fi Society, is in the South. He was just nominated for the Dragon Con diversity wing, along with others, for the Dragon Con, which is out of Atlanta. And so Dragon Con has, taken on the challenge. And so the Black Sci-Fi Society, look up Jarvis Sheffield. I think you'll be surprised at what's happening in the South.
I love that, whoever that was. My mind is still stuck on James Brown a little, so I love whoever threw that question out. My mind just went to, without James Brown and his capes, you don't get Billy D. Williams lacing up with a cape on for Lando Calrissian for Star Wars. And I would dare say he saved the day. He is like the Oscar Schindler of the Star Wars universe for me in so many different ways. He doesn't get his due respect. But just the nature of that, seeing a Black man in Star Wars, that comes from making Slit Smart Liquor Bull commercials. There's something special about the bifurcation of that as well, to be able to live in the dichotomy of that as a Black man during that time period.
And especially if you think about, when you talk about sci-fi, when you talk about fantasy, for many Black people don't exist in the future. They don't exist in sci-fi. But clearly that's proven wrong with Lando. So it's like, yeah, we're here. We've always been here. We're going to be here after you leave, and we're going to continue to, the world is going to continue to go, and we will be in it. And so another small plug for ATL, OnyxCon. There's a comic convention there. So definitely, got to add that into, which is Black owned, Black run in Atlanta. So the South got, as Outcast said, the South got something to say, and it's a matter of making sure that they get heard.
Yeah, I have a question for Summer, if you don't mind. Seeing how we're both at Union, how do we integrate the fabric of this more so into what we're doing? I often feel that I don't have a good way of asking this question. It's going to sound a little weird, so please forgive me. I feel like the very oppressive sometimes for this movement is the church. That's a weird. So how do we make a shift with that, if you see it being the same way?
I do see it being the same way. I think that you need to be able to mentally escape and get out of thinking of things in a religious church world. So for me, I like to go back to my history books or my favorite TV show or a movie or something and see what is being said in that is relevant. And what does the Bible also bring into play? What am I learning in my theology class that, regardless of how irritating it might be, is still useful and beneficial? And how can that advance Black life and Black voices in this context, particularly at this institution? Which I think does a good job of helping to create space for us But sometimes it doesn't quite work, right? Because this is still a white institution. But being able to have a little bit of space and then not just taking the inch or the foot they give you and taking a mile and running with it and speaking truth to power is essential. And a lot of times I know for myself, it really does come to me falling back on, okay, what did Black Panther say? What did Killmonger say about that? Just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors because that's necessary, because it's better to go there than die here locked up. And there's so many things that are seemingly unrelated to the world of seminary life or church life that are integral. And in my own like pre-seminary background with my education, I was studying theater and archaeology. Those don't automatically mesh. Those don't go together. But I've taken those things and I'm putting them into my world here in seminary. And now I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's the next thing I'm going to write? Because I already wrote one play that had nothing to do with the church, but a few nuggets. Okay, what can I do now? And I have this idea of why is it that Black people spiritually are so terrifying? Why is it that this more charismatic or speaking in tongues version of theology and church life is weird and horrible and scary? Why is it that Black people expressing that form of spirituality is so immensely terrifying? It would be a great idea if we would just sit down and make the world's best scary movie. And it's just a Black man or Black woman who is fully walking in the spirit and speaking in tongues. And it's things like that that take you out of the direct line of thinking of what church or seminary is that are helpful because they make you think. And that forced thought helps you think of ways to advance Black voices and Black life here.
Thank you for that, because now I just want to say to the professors listening, what I hear is some are saying that we're not reading Barth or Bonhoeffer during the month of February, and even henceforward, going forward from this point. That's what I hear. I'm just joking. I ask that in the sense that I think about like how do we recontextualize our childhood theories on what church is, and so thank you for answering that question, because I've been thinking about like this radical imagination and reimagining something like heaven in itself. Like I don't want to go to a heaven where there's some bald naked white babies meeting me at the gate playing some harps, but that's like that prototype that you get in your head as a kid, wherever it comes from. I'd rather have like Parliament Funkadelic meeting me at the gates playing, Swing Down to Jerry's House or something. I don't want this sanitized version of a heaven that I know, I feel like we're much worthy, more worthy of as people of color.
One of the things I wanted to chime in there, I use a couple of things. I'm not at the seminary, so I'm kind of outside of the seminary now. But I use a couple of things. In my writing, I talk about living as if the purple is already promised, right? Living as if the purple is already promised. And in theological language, that's eschatological hope. That's living in the now, using vis-a-vis James Cone and Katie Cannon. Living in the now as if it's here in the right now that we have to make the difference. And so when we're talking about Afrofuturism and eschatological hope, we're thinking otherworldly. We're thinking, how do we bring that otherworldliness to bear on our right here and our right now? And so that's that living as if the purple is already promised. And then the second thing is, preacher hat off, professor hat off, preacher hat on. My first two this month, sermons this month, one was called A New Hope, which of course is the launching of Star Wars, and then just today's Tuesday. Sunday I preached Octavia Butler. Prayer is respect of God, and use that to launch my word. And so you can continue to press. So instead of you reading Barth perhaps and Bonhoeffer, you read Butler. All right. So it's there and it's applicable. I'm grateful that I had, even in very cold Boston, mentors who said, Sakina, be you. And so, you may have to force your authentic self in the seminary space. I attended Boston University for my seminary years. And, I said, I have to write a poem or a short story after every one of these academic papers. And I had professors who let me do that. I had others who called me uppity. So, you have to force yourself into the spaces and be authentic to yourself, even if it goes on the shelf for later. You know, my husband's been carrying around my books for 26 years, he says, you know, and so lots of them include files from seminary short stories and poems that did not get published yet. But because I was able to say, in the learning of this, in the right now, I may not get this moment back. I have to write this because it's in the now. Seminary is a time, a precious time, that you have to capitalize on that experience in a way that it doesn't come back after in the years after.
As a point of personal privilege, I think I want to add to this conversation, both as a professor at this institution, but also in someone who is very deeply asking this question for how we think about the future of theological education, not only at Union Press, but also as we think of this around the world. And one of this is Dr. Cannon said that every person sitting in her classroom represented the hinges upon which the future swings, which is directly related to the title of the forthcoming conference by the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership this April. But in addition to that, I think that what we often forget about Dr. Cannon is that as she was an ethicist, a thinker, she was also an artist, that she understood divine creativity as well as imagination as a pathway to, again, cultivating whole communities. And so this is not a sense of leaving kind of this Black speculative fiction or even imaginative work or artistry as an aside to our seminary education. Part of my work in both teaching at this institution is that these are coupled. I mean, we need to not only have courses like Womanist Literature and Theological Imagination that literally takes up the theological imagination of Seeley and of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and, Octavia Butler, and looking at prophetic parables, even in pandemic times, right? I think these must become central sources and texts for our own discovery and imagination. Beyond that, though, I think what we're really getting to is that divine imagination that is something that is God-given. Right. And that our imagination is not something that we leave outside. In fact, imagination helps us become better preachers. Imagination, I would dare say, helps us become better leaders as we think about how we transform institutions and undo structures and contexts. To that point, I'm thinking about this in terms of what ways might Black spirituality impact or be related to the imagination of Black futures. I'm thinking about that in the context of Janelle Monáe and her use of Cindy Mayweather as this messianic figure who goes to lift the downtrodden and provides resources there for social change. I'm wondering, can we use these imaginative works as also ways, devotionals, or also aspects to tap in a deeper Black spirituality?
I just want to say amen to that. I think your question is the answer in many ways for me. I just was taking notes on, I think we should. I love that you were saying that. I love to see, and thank you, Rev, for sharing those sermon titles and topics that you were doing. And I think that work is happening a lot. I definitely think, and I want to be clear, I'm not shamming on Bartha Bonhoeffer. I've just been more pushing points there. But I think that work is happening even if we look at the fusion of something like jazz. We look at the work of like Monk and Coltrane and Miles Davis, they were very much doing that. And that could be more of for some, that could be a conducive gateway. It could be an easier gateway than some of the things that they're visually seeing that they're quick to dismiss. I find that if the church is quick to dismiss some of the other things that are just not as visually appealing for them, they already have accepted it on some level. They just don't realize it yet.
That makes me think, Dr. Grace, I remember when Lovecraft Country was happening, both of us were having coffee talk and talking about the deeply spiritual ways in which that particular segment was scripted. I just wanted to know if you'd speak to that in some way.
You read my mind. You read my mind. Yeah, the Holy Ghost episode, which was and still one of my favorite episodes of Lovecraft Country, and just in general television episodes, one of my favorites. The way in which we see different levels of spirituality being presented, from the Orishas to, having Shirley Caesar's Satan, we're gonna tear your kingdom down, playing in the background, to channeling the ancestors in a circle, in a ring, and basically pushing out the oppressor. And for someone who's not in, I've not gone to seminary school, I have huge respect and went to church and all, and love the Lord, and seeing how the way in which this TV show gave me a way to look at religion, spirituality in so many different ways, and the way it was researched, because so often television really doesn't do justice to spirit, particularly African spirituality. It's voodoo. Oh, it's so bad. Oh my God, it's about pinning needles into dolls, and it really doesn't get its true due just as far as the passion that it beholds, the power that it beholds. And so I feel as though television has a way to be able to kind of offer another narrative or way to talk about spirituality, and especially if it's researched right, and you can get people to be engaged in these discussions who may not otherwise have been engaged with it from before.
Can I ask the sisters here a question about Lovecraft?
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love it. I want to be clear about that. So I'm just pushing this just to ask. How do you feel about the colorism of that text and the show? How do you feel like it contributes to the divisive nature of it, if at all?
So you're meaning between the two sisters, between Letty and Ruby?
I am.
So I feel it's a reality that needs to be talked about. We can't just brush it under the rug. That is a reality of what exists, and if we have to critique it, but I think we also have to have the hard discussions about it. About what Ruby experienced, and or what maybe one might say Letty luxuries that she had, and the ways in which maybe people see Ruby as a side character. I saw her as someone who just told her like it was, and it was really unapologetic, unafraid, sometimes a voice of reason. And so I actually personally think it was something that needed to be put out there. We needed to have that discussion. We needed to push our comfort level as it related to that.
And I would challenge to say that not only is it real, but it gets to the deeper layers of the way in which we engage in survival and navigate that realness. And so how do we navigate it? How do we, in our everyday practice, and we saw that on the screen, and we saw it in the screen both in the supernatural and in the natural. And one of the other, this notion, I think, Reverend Melanie, you talked about the messianic female figure. Certainly Lovecraft. We think that, the first blush, is to think that, Tick is the messianic figure, when in reality, it's all three of the lead females. So in one instance, Letty is that, that warrior woman. She's the Ya Santiwa, woman that will go where the men ain't gonna go. Come on, y'all gonna get up out of here. So that's the Letty, where each Ruby and why did I forget Mama's name? I'm sorry, Orinthia Blue.
Hippolyta. Mm-hmm.
Hippolyta, thank you. Each one of those characters also bring a different form of female messianic strength to the screen, and in some ways, particularly Hippolyta, who understands, and people were mad because she left her daughter, for example, but people understood that was something that she had to do later on after they saw the fullness of it for her own survival, and then was able to come back, right? and it was at a cost. And so what cost does that happen at? And Black women have been doing that for years. And it tells our story. Again, re-narrating and our story in a way that is revisioned, certainly in Lovecraft country, the country that is white, patriarchal, scary horror. That's what Lovecraft was all about, H.P. Lovecraft. So when you create that, you're creating a mirror image. So what was the true horror? Racism. What was the true monster? Racism. The true horror was the way in which racism is insidious. Then how do we saw they still found joy in that. They still found life in that. They still found a way to survive and navigate that. That's what navigating Lovecraft country was all about.
And I would even add that Dee is also a messianic figure, because she picks up the torch to continue what Letty, Hippolyta, and Ruby have started.
So
and
there's that Sankofa.
Exactly.
That past, present, the future.
That bring it exactly. And so this young, teenage girl, who many would just think, oh, she's just a teenager. She has nothing. She can't do anything, but she's got a lot. And it's like, don't underestimate her. If, without spoilers, if you see one of the last scenes, you don't underestimate anyone, and especially, Black women and girls, because, of what we are capable of doing. And so, yeah, I would even definitely throw in Dee as far as she's carrying the torch and keeping the fire lit.
I would add to that, when I see Tick's crucifix, if you will, that last episode, it opens up for me a new way that we all should be reading the women who were there with Jesus, and ultimately become not only the storytellers, to see them not as in passive roles, but perhaps even active roles, even there at the cross, and being a part of his burial and so forth. So that opened up a new understanding for who tells this gospel, even beyond what has happened, its tragedy.
And I think that's kind of alluding to the question of like Black women, the role of Black women in Afrofuturist discourse. Like, I mean, we are shapeshifters. We are change agents. We defy what is acceptable. We create the standard. We disrupt the norm and create our own norm. If you think it through Lovecraft, if you think about through the recent elections of, especially 2016 with, the ushering of several of the congresswomen, 2018, and then, of course, 2021 with, our VP. And so you see, Black women, we as they say, we try to tell you. And so it's almost as if, Black women have, written the narrative already, and we're just, trying to make sure you get on board so that you don't miss out on anything. And, especially within Afrofuturism, Black women always exist, always. I mean, when some of the first people that we mentioned were Black women: Octavia Butler, Nnedi Okorafor, N.K. Jemisin. If we want to go music-wise, the LaBelles. So Black women are constantly in the discussion. They're always being weaved in and out, and it's like you kind of can't have Afrofuturism without Black women. I mean, they in a way birth, a lot of what is happening and what is transpiring.
I think that's why you mentioned earlier, Dr. Grace, you mentioned about Wonder Woman. And part of my frustration with Wonder Woman is that Grecian Amazons are fantastical, right? There are no such things as Grecian Amazons other than the narratives that we have from these kind of fantasy stories. But when we know there has been a documented, regimented group of warrior women who were African soldiers, warrior women of Dahomey, and their stories do not get told, but yet we pay millions of dollars to create and maintain a fantastical story of Greek origin that is not true. I think Afrofuturism opens up for us some ways of pressing into the Black divine feminine. But I'm curious to ask you all, How do you think Afrofuturism might help us to examine structural oppression in new ways? Summer, I'll let you jump in on that first.
Yeah, I think that Afrofuturism allows for us to force in our history as an Afro people, right? So it allows us the space to create narratives that focus on those African warrior women, those great historical figures that have been forgotten about and ignored. But also to look at, okay, how do we take this historical element and how do we advance it and look at what it can look like in the future? How do we make it sci-fi-ish? How do we make it normal, but still forcing through what it means and what it is to be Black in this world? And really lean into our history, our artistry, and all the different things that make us who we are.
Reverend Mel, when you were talking about the woman of Dahomey, I was like, yes, you know, and on one hand, we want to say, well, you know, we have the Dora Milaje, you know, but, you know, that's Black Panther and that's a spinoff from Black Panther. And it was great to see in print where Black women, for example, became the authors of those comics. So it was great to see Roxane Gay do Dora Milaje. It was great to see Annette Okorafor pick up Shuri. However, there are other stories besides the Dora Milaje that need to get told in a way that, again, pulls through history and says, and asks the imagined question, as Summer said, what does it look like in the near future? Because that near future then therefore inspires. That near future is oftentimes, it may seem fantastical, but it's right on the cusp of, oh, we can do that right now. That we have a way of doing that right now. So I think that's one of the reasons, you know, I enjoy talking across generations, children, but to older women, because they help us bring back other possibilities. So again, using our ancestral knowledge to create a future. One example was we're talking again. I tell you, I've talked to kids about superpowers, and you know, I talked about love, and they said, well, what if you were able to put your hand on someone and give them love and then bring them back to life? And I think Reverend Dia, you'll like this, you know, the music, back to life, back to, you know, so they had to create a soundtrack. So they immediately put that soundtrack with the superpower, right? And then, you know, we talked about, well, what do we do with that? Well, grandma made roots. All right. And so grandma's roots was able to be maybe dispersed in a mist or in vials to get rid of, you know, COVID. These kids were coming up with possibilities based on our very real condition of our lives. They were creating superpowers. And so I think that if we think about it being a near future, we can possibly think about the ways in which we can harness those ideas, those imagined possibilities for a better future, for a better African particular future.
In relation to the structural part of the question you asked, and in connection with Dora Milaje, I think it opens the door. I think one of the most oppressive systems that we have is the education system, and just having kids, you know, regardless of their race, be exposed to Dora Milaje opens the door to forming our own or reintroducing our own Dora Milaje in the form of Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Shirley Chisholm, you know, individuals that didn't hear those names, the Staple Sisters. The list goes on and on. These, you know, notorious women that have always been paving the way. That's what I think a group like the Dora Milaje does. And I think it also, to do a classroom audit now, for me, to step in a room, and if I'm examining for, you know, whatever your racial bias is in your institution, and not have Nick Stone or Jason Reynolds or Ta-Nehisi Coates on your shelf is very much problematic at this point, or someone that's indicative of presenting a narrative in the way that they go about presenting it.
And I think we too have to be open to using various mediums, as we have already been talking about tonight. So whether it's through the arts, whether it is through comics, whether it is through music, you know, having these discussions that futurism has all the time that examine structural oppression. So I'm thinking about the sister Jackie Orms, who was one of the first black cartoonists to have a syndicated comic strip. And in her comic strip, Torchy Brown and Dixie to Harlem, she talked about everything from critiquing the government. She talked about Black womanhood. She talked about socioeconomic issues that were going on within these neighborhoods. And this is through a comic strip. And so you're able to see that, you know, through various mediums, we can critique systems. We can talk about, you know, structural oppressions by us, and at the same time still give voice. So while I'm critiquing you, I'm still also making sure that my voice gets acknowledged and is recognized. And so, you know, Afrofuturism allows for those mediums to happen. We have to, you know, embrace those mediums. We have to, you know, learn how to, you know, finagle them or make them work to our advantage. And these are ways that we can go into structural oppression without trying to use the same method, the same route all the time.
That makes me think about these colonizers are tricky. Their system worked out just the way they planned it, but it makes me think about, like, if we embrace these methods and these mediums also, the assessment tool that we use for our structural system has to change. Like I've gone through my entire education with someone wanting to assess my knowledge with an essay. There's never going to be a point in my life where I say, oh, I learned such and such, so I'm going to write an essay. However, if they ask me to use one of these mediums to justify my intellect on whatever it is they told me to study, whether I can write it poetically, if I can perform it, if I can paint it, that may be a better metric for gauging this universe and our output and our contribution to real structural change. But as long as we're writing it down in an essay or something, I don't know. There's some articles I've read since I've been in seminary I'm never going to read again. I know my professors listening, I don't care. I'm never going to read again. I'm going to shred those things. I'm going to dance and laugh about it. Because I know that the measurements that we've always used as a community are the best measurements for everyone.
And so I'll give you an example, Reverend Dear. Dr. Emily Towns in 2000, 2001 took that approach to measuring and testing. She assigned digital projects rather than essays for her final project. When I teach an upper division class now, that's what I use. They can do whatever form. I've had students do websites. I've had students put together just a digital presentation. I've had students put together some other kind of digital game, actually. And so whatever form of multimedia they wanted to use, I gave them the leeway to. I got that from Dr. Emily Towns, right? And so we have to engage, you're right, in what we have seen given to us, and then apply that. And so when you start teaching, you have to do the same.
Yes, ma'am.
And speaking of that, with my, I'm teaching a Black popular culture class right now. And one of the things that my students have to do for their midterm and their final is not an exam. You have to actually create a hashtag syllabus for your midterm. So I need, you know, what hashtag has been popular, and create a syllabus using art, music, film, television, museums, you know, and create the syllabus of that corresponds to the hashtag. And then your final is a TED Talk. So instead of you memorizing everything that we read and regurgitating it, no, I want you to perform it now. I want you to give me, you know, this detailed 5 to 7 minute presentation on a particular topic. And for me, I've learned that students are much more engaged that way. They want to learn that way. They can, you know, see the material differently versus just like having to write this short essay. Not saying that that's not effective, but in certain ways, sometimes you have to alter the measurement so that you can ensure that they will learn and maybe even take it with them to somebody else and pass it on. So yeah, we definitely have to adjust the metric, you know, transform it, evolve it.
I absolutely agree with revising the metrics. And I would add to that, expanding our sources for and of knowledge production, right? That we see value in the film, value in the music, just as we might see value in the written text. And part of that is, I mean, one of the I think, first dissertations, and I can't think of the man's name who finished with his dissertation as a film. Like, we have to not only expect that from students in graduate school or in seminary or in college or, school age, but also at the highest levels, right? To say that we actually value a multiplicity of sources for knowledge production. I am getting another question from Dr. Sadler. I'll call him out here. He asked, let's talk about Prince as a manifestation of Afrofuturism, with notions of Paisley Park and Uptown as visions of a future world with peace and universal harmony. He says, how do you think Prince's discussions of God foster a vision for a better world?
I think someone may be better answering that than me, but I will say he definitely fosters a new sense of defining masculinity in a beautiful way for me. And if that means in relation to me understanding God, that I start to view God in a non-binary form, more so than the prescribed one that we often receive, I think that is a great gift to receive from Prince. I certainly think the greatest movie ever is Purple Rain. There's a selfish plug right there. I know Dr. Sadler would agree with me there. But Prince definitely does that in a quite a remarkable way. And to have him do the soundtrack for Batman is another great plug.
I'll add from the vantage point of color. So the fact that, purple resonates with him in just about everything that he does. And the fact that, purple is this color of royalty, and the fact that he saw so highly of himself, I think is something that kind of puts him into that category, and kind of like not necessarily putting on a pedestal, but he was confident, and that exuded in everything that he did. And so, whether it was, like I said, the color that he presented on himself all the time, definitely I feel like kind of speaks to, this discussion of maybe God, or maybe even just higher being sake.
And one of the other things I think Prince was successful at doing was this note, to take the question, because the discussion of God, we use this phrase all the time, holy boldness. He was wholly bold about sex. He was wholly bold about, music. He was wholly bold about relationships. He was wholly bold about his life and his choices he made, and would admit that, whether he made an error or whether he needed to change his ways, he would admit that. And so this sense of authenticity, I think, is present in Prince's work, and what, again, in the conversations that we may not have gotten to yet when we talk about spirituality and sex, Prince did that. And quite honestly, part of our conversations around spirituality is to challenge our comfort level. Prince challenged a lot of folk comfort level. Big Prince fan here. So.
And if this movement defines what it means to nurture community, I think Prince definitely does that in a remarkable way. Just a spectrum of individuals that gravitate to his work and to his, embodiment and persona. Mars Day, in the time, and everyone that, gravitated to him. There's something special about what this movement means in relation to nurturing community with individuals that possibly wouldn't have done it before.
I'm curious about how Afrofuturism might create space for us to look from another world or alternative world about what's happening in ours. Will any of you speak to that?
Well, many will argue, such as Samuel Delaney, that is the task of science fiction writ large. To more specifically, Alondra Nelson again talks about it, science fiction and Afrofuturism being a social reflection and a social echo of what's the contemporary issues that we're going through right now. And so this notion of seeing something as otherworldly is really about seeing something that's going on in our own world and wrestling with it, even though we're thinking of it in an alternative verse or alternative universe. I think one example, we mentioned Miles Morales earlier and the Spider-Verse. The Spider-Verse is just that kind of manifestation or product that cultural product that shows us the diversity and helps us wrestle with the possibility of the other being in another universe. And so how does that come back and impact our contemporary context? That's what we need to begin to continue to wrestle with. And I think that's what science fiction does. It helps us bring it back and to also put issues in a place where we can step back from it a little bit. So whether it was Uhura, in Star Trek, and she tells her story. She tells her story about, going through racism in that production. But yet, because she was on that, she was able to breach so many barriers. And she tells her story about the weekend that she was going to quit. And if you don't know the story, the weekend that she was going to quit was the weekend she gave Gene Roddenberry a letter and said, "I'm done. I'm tired. I'm exhausted." And he said, "I'll take your letter. I'm going to put it in the drawer. Come back, talk to me on Monday." Well, she then left and over the weekend went to an NAACP banquet. And the NAACP president said, "Your greatest fan is here." And she's like, "Who's my greatest fan?" And it was Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King said, "You can't quit," because she told him, "Dr. King, I'm about to," she said, "You can't. You are making such a difference in terms of representation, gender." And of course, he didn't have those exact languages, but she tells that story. And she says she went back to Gene Roddenberry, of course, that Monday and says, "I'm not going to quit." And as a result, of course, he handed her a ripped up letter that he said, "I knew you weren't going to quit. We're doing good work here." And so it's about seeing the possibility, again, the eschatological hope, the anticipated possibilities of what it can do for our everyday practical lives that sci-fi allows us to do.
And I think Afrofuturism becomes this universal language that not only is it, although it was popularized in this Western format, but, the fact that we can talk about something like Attack the Block, which happens in, Brixton in London. And, we can talk about Carnival in either Trinidad or Brazil, or, we can talk about what, happens, just pick a place. And we can talk about the imagination. We can talk about, what the future beholds of that. And so Afrofuturism becomes this universal language that allows us to talk about other things in different places so that we can see it, through these different lenses.
When I hear both of you talk, I'm reminded of how the Christian story is both otherworldly and, in the here and now and in the what is to come. So we're already attuned to these aspects of moving in and out of and between worlds. And I think Afrofuturism provides us another lens. I'm recognizing our time, and I want to open us up for a final question that all of you might leave a final word for us. But my question here is, with our shift in politics at the national level and the agitation that has happened in terms of Black Lives Matter in its quest for justice, how does Afrofuturism, how does the aesthetics play a role in where we go from here and how the movement continues to push forward?
I love that question. That's an interesting question. I got three things that come to mind. One is in relation to, would you say the last part of the question again, please?
How does Afrofuturism inform this movement as we go forward? Where do we kind of go from here?
I think one of the forwards for me is like looking at, holistic medicine and science. They don't have to be in silos. When I think about Afrofuturism and some of the texts and the books that I've read and the comic books like that, and I keep going back to Wakanda. I mean, it's the most visible present one for people to make reference to, the ideal of what medicine represents in a holistic way, whether it's physical or mental. I hope going forward that they can live and they can conflate more with each other. Another one is looking at the value and appreciation for creatives, not just as commodity. I often feel like that is the case, that everything in relation to us becomes so commodified that, I hope that shift really comes. Or if it is going to be commodified, that those individuals are valued monetary, that they are getting the just financially that they deserve, richly and rightly deserve. And then the last, I would say, education. I hope that this movement does have a long-term shift in education. Right now, it just feels like, it does not feel like Afrofuturism for me feels like a quality of life. Education should feel like a quality of life. It feels like a business. I don't want my embodiment, my well-being, my mental and physical health feeling like a business. And that's what education feels like. And I think this very movement is asking for that shift to take place. If we're sitting at the table and we're writing the narratives, well, part of that narrative is that this is a quality of life.
I would say for me, Afrofuturism plays a role in where we go from here, in that it provides a sense of hope. It provides a sense of promise, and it, provides a sense of change. And these are all things that when I'm doing my work, whatever it is, whether it's fictional or whether it's in African American studies or whatever the case may be, my hope is that I can change and that I can provide a promise that will, create a legacy. And so, because it's all about, what do I leave behind? What does the next person pick up and continue with? And so for me, that's what I see the role of Afrofuturism is. It's promise, it's hope, it's change, and what's going to happen next. And because that's the question I always ask is, what's next? What's going to happen tomorrow? Because I'm always seeing myself in the tomorrow. And so, those is kind of like what I see with the role of Afrofuturism going forward.
I would say for me, in addition to Afrofuturism being hope, that it's also a push to continue the conversation and not let it just stall out or slow down. That this movement, this realm of thought and artistry is helping keep these things in the forefront of our minds. It's not allowing these things to die down and calm down. It's forcing you to fully acknowledge that there is an issue that needs to be addressed. And I think that is extremely essential to solving and making better our country and our lives as a people.
I would say one of the things that Afrofuturism and Black speculative fiction writ large offers us is a way to not only see the world, but also be in the world. One of the things you said, Dr. Dia, Reverend Dia, was what sum up the word is livity. Livity is a Rastafarian term about living your best life, and every choice you make is about this modality of something is in our language, life-giving or death-dealing, right? To take Mercy Orioye's quote. So if something is life-giving or death-dealing, well, livity, this Rastafarian concept, is so Afrofuturist. It's incredible. It's about, in all that we do, we take it and we shape and move and have our being in this sensibility that we are creating something both to take from the past into the future. We are in the now, right? In the right here, right now, we are creating a future for somebody else. And so if we live that way, in a constant Afrofuturist modality, then we are creating those things. We are creating radical self-care. We are creating radical forms of spirituality. We are creating radical forms of education. But in the now, we have to recognize that it's uncomfortable, like the Sankofa bird, excuse me, whose body's in constant motion, but constant moving back, right? And so it's uncomfortable in the now, but we have to live with a sense of livity. So that's.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. I agree that Afrofuturism, again, is grounded in science fiction, magic, fantasy, Afrocentricity, historical fiction, and creative imagination. And it is a contemporary Black aesthetic that activists and artists have used to imagine a better future for people of color. It is a movement art. that seeks to utilize the possibilities of the present in order to create a new world. And I often think its starting point is for us to finish the sentence, in a world where Black Lives Matter, I imagine. Again, thank you to our panelists who have joined us for taking out your time. Thank you to all of the listeners who have joined us online. We certainly appreciate you for staying on for this conversation. And for those of you who were intrigued by this conversation, please join us at the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at our forthcoming conference in April, The Hinges Upon Which the Future Swings, Womanism as a Living Legacy, and a Gateway to Our Futures this April, as well as join us for future conversations next month on womanist theology and activism. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Jones, and thank you for watching. If you registered for the forum, please share your thoughts by taking a 2-minute survey that will be emailed to you at the end of the broadcast. Please join us again for our next panel discussion on womanist activism, movement making, and Breonna Taylor. This webinar will be Tuesday, March 16th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Watch your email for registration. We hope you'll join us then. Have a great day.
Let me be very clear. This is a serious matter. COVID-19, COVID-16-19, COVID-45 requires that Black women of all nations, of all creeds, of all generations, of all colors, of all faith, gather in one place together to refocus, to recenter, to reposition, and dare I say reckon with the future. I've gathered leading scholars, thinkers, artists, and innovators to be our digital guides and griots. Meet us where the power resides.